Story number one. The recording studio where I interned occupied the upper floor of a Manhattan office building, protected by an intricate security system. The elevator wouldn't even access our floor without someone at the front desk activating it after verifying visitors through our 3-camera setup. In the dead of night, that security system felt less like protection and more like a cage. During my overnight maintenance shift with Jake, the elevator's mechanical whir pierced the silence at 3:30 a.m. I was organizing cables in Studio B, methodically sorting XLR from TRS, while he wiped down the vintage SSL mixing console in the main room. The sound was unmistakable, the familiar hum of motors and cables that usually signaled arriving clients. Except at this hour, the building had been empty for nearly 9 hours. The security monitors cast a pale blue glow across the front desk as Jake checked the feeds. The lobby camera showed an empty entrance, its motion sensors dormant. The elevator camera displayed an equally vacant car, its fluorescent lights humming steadily. The third camera revealed no one at the floor access point. We exchanged glances as the elevator continued its ascent, the floor indicator lights climbing steadily toward our level. Each ping of passing floors echoed through the empty hallways. I found myself counting the floor numbers along with the lights. 10, 11, 12. The mechanical sounds grew louder, transforming from a distant whir into the unmistakable sound of approaching machinery. Our floor's indicator light illuminated with a sharp ding that seemed to physically push against my eardrums. I stood frozen behind the reception desk, my hands gripping the edge of the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. Jake remained motionless by the equipment rack, cleaning cloth still raised mid-wipe. His reflection distorted in the darkened studio windows that overlooked the sleeping city below. The doors slid open with their characteristic hydraulic sigh, the sound impossibly loud in the dead air of the studio. The elevator car's interior lights cast a stark fluorescent rectangle onto our floor's dark carpet, creating harsh shadows that seemed to writhe at the edges. Empty, completely empty. The usual 5-second countdown for the doors to close came and went. 10 seconds passed. 15, 20. The doors remained open, the motion sensor apparently detecting something in the threshold that our eyes couldn't see. The air changed first. The temperature plummeted several degrees, though the digital thermostat on the wall continued to display a steady 72 degrees Fahrenheit. The normally comforting hum of rack-mounted equipment took on an oppressive quality, as if the machines were holding their breath along with us. The overhead LED panels flickered. Just once, barely perceptible, but enough to send a jolt of adrenaline through my system. The $300,000 worth of vintage microphones in their glass display case began to vibrate ever so slightly, their gold diaphragms catching the light. Our studio had top-of-the-line acoustical treatment, enough absorption and diffusion to create perfect recording conditions. But in that moment, the carefully calculated sound dampening seemed to work in reverse. Every small noise, the tick of the analog clock, the faint hiss of the ventilation system, the subtle creak of the building's structure, became amplified, distorted, wrong. After 30 seconds of this standoff, the doors finally closed with a sound that resembled a gasp more than their usual mechanical whisper. The elevator descended to the lobby, its machinery sounds fading into the building's ambient noise, though now every mechanical noise seemed to carry an extra note of menace. Jake and I turned to each other simultaneously, both mouthing "what the fuck" in stunned disbelief. The studio suddenly felt much larger and emptier than before, the shadows in the unused recording booths deeper and more absolute. When I mentioned the incident to the day shift the next morning, Steve, one of our senior engineers, went pale. His coffee cup clattered against its saucer as he described an identical experience from 2 weeks prior. Same time of night, same extended door hold, same inexplicable cold spot. The elevator maintenance log showed no malfunctions or service calls for that period. The building's electrical usage charts showed no power spikes or anomalies. The following week, I requested a transfer to day shifts. Management approved it without question. They never acknowledged why they had a policy of always scheduling at least 2 people for overnight shifts, but after that night, I understood. Story number 2. As night watch at Fort Gordon, I patrolled the barracks' empty corridors, my footsteps echoing off institutional tiles and concrete walls. The building was 3 floors of identical rooms, connected by straight hallways and metal stairwells. The second floor was usually the quietest, which made the sudden shout from down the hallway jar against the silence like broken glass. My boots squeaked against the linoleum as I sprinted toward the sound, duty belt rattling, mind racing through scenarios of fights or accidents or worse. The door flew open under my hand to reveal 4 soldiers, all wide awake despite the hour, pointing at the ceiling tiles near the wall with shaking hands. "They're doing it again," Private Rodriguez said, voice cracking. The others nodded, eyes still fixed upward. The room itself was standard-issue military quarters. Wall lockers, steel-frame beds, desks bolted to the floor. But something about their collective fear made the familiar space feel wrong. The overhead lights buzzed incessantly, casting harsh shadows across their faces. They told me it had been happening for weeks since they moved in after basic training. At night, something, would lift the ceiling tiles near the corner and peer down at them. Each description matched perfectly. Faces, always different, always grinning, sometimes laughing silently, sometimes just watching, never speaking, never blinking. Private Chen gripped his blanket as he described an elderly woman's face from the previous night, skin gray and papery, eyes milky and unfocused. Specialist Williams had seen a child's face 2 nights ago, but with adult teeth, yellowed and overcrowded. Rodriguez swore he'd seen something that looked like his brother, who died years ago in a car accident. Same scar above the eyebrow, same crooked smile, but wrong somehow. The incident reports stretched back months. 3 different groups had occupied room 237 since January. The first group lasted 2 weeks before requesting transfers, citing strange noises and safety concerns. The second group stayed a month. Their complaints mentioned faces in the ceiling and unexplained disturbances. The third group's sergeant found them sleeping in the day room after a week, refusing to return to their bunks. I reviewed the sergeant's notes from that third group. His report detailed how he'd found his soldiers huddled in the corner of the day room, their uniforms soaked with sweat despite the AC running full blast. One soldier kept repeating, "It knows us now," while staring at the ceiling. The sergeant had spent the night in the room himself but logged no unusual activity. The next morning, he approved their transfer request without comment. Previous investigations revealed nothing conclusive. The building's maintenance logs showed no structural issues, no hidden crawl spaces, no access points between floors. The ventilation system had been cleaned and inspected twice. The electrical wiring was up to code. Even the pest control team had done a thorough sweep, finding no signs of animals that could explain the noises. I pulled the room's file before heading to investigate. Polaroid photos from previous inspections showed the same solid cinder block wall above the tiles. Measurements matched across every report. The gap never varied, 1.3 inches between tile and concrete. The building's original blueprints confirmed, no service tunnels, no maintenance spaces, just solid construction designed to last decades. The latrine shared that wall. I checked it immediately, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Empty stalls, dripping faucets. The motion sensor lights clicked on as I entered, revealing no signs of tampering, no access to the ceiling. The ventilation grills were intact, too small for even a child to crawl through. I checked every stall, every corner, even got down on my hands and knees to look under the partition walls. Nothing. Back in the soldiers' room, I dragged one of the heavy desks below the spot they indicated. The metal legs scraped against the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Standing on the desk surface, my head nearly touched the ceiling. The acoustic tiles were standard issue, the same as every other room in the building. Lightweight, flimsy, easily lifted. I pressed upward, sliding one aside. The beam of my flashlight revealed only solid cinder block, running unbroken from the back of the tile to the floor above. The gap was barely an inch wide. There was no crawl space, no ductwork, nowhere for anyone, anything to hide. Physically impossible for any face to peer through. I measured it 3 times, exactly 1.3 inches between tile and concrete. 2 of the soldiers bolted immediately. I heard their footsteps pounding down the hallway, followed by the sound of blankets and sleeping bags being arranged on the floor out there. The remaining soldiers stared at me, waiting for an explanation I couldn't give. The rest of my shift was spent documenting the incident in the watch log, measuring and photographing the wall, and checking every room along that section of the hallway. But those clinical details couldn't explain away what 4 separate soldiers had seen. When I passed that room on my next patrol, the ceiling tile had slid back into place. Story number 3. The 3 a.m. shift at Subway meant endless cups of burnt coffee and watching security footage of myself making sandwiches to stay awake. Tonight was no different. I was elbow deep in dishes while Jake cleaned the ovens, the smell of cleaning chemicals mixing with lingering notes of baked bread and red wine vinegar. The shopping center was always dead at this hour. Our little sandwich shop sat between a nail salon and a dry cleaner, both dark and silent. The only signs of life came from the 24-hour gas station across the parking lot, its harsh lights creating pools of yellow on the empty asphalt. The occasional semi-truck would rumble by on the highway behind us, their headlights briefly illuminating the walls before fading back into darkness. The electronic door chime pierced the silence. "Welcome to Subway," I called out automatically, muscle memory kicking in before my brain fully registered the sound. Turning toward the front, I felt the first twist of unease in my stomach. The fluorescent lights revealed empty tables and vacant seats. Through the glass storefront, the parking lot was deserted except for our 2 cars and a single streetlight flickering in the distance. My first thought was Jake sneaking out for a smoke break. He'd sometimes hop the counter rather than use the back door. But something felt different this time. The air had changed, becoming dense and heavy, like the atmosphere before a storm. When I returned to the dishes, the chime sounded again. This time I did a thorough check. Both bathrooms empty, the walk-in cooler empty, the storage area empty. Every corner of our small restaurant proved devoid of customers or explanation. I positioned myself behind the counter, watching the doors intently. The digital clock on the register clicked over to 3:37 a.m. Outside, the gas station's lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized. The bread warmers behind me clicked as they cycled on, their heating elements casting an orange glow that reflected off the stainless steel walls. Minutes crept by until Jake emerged from the back delivery entrance carrying an empty garbage bag. "Where'd you go?" I asked, not taking my eyes off the front doors. The words came out in a whisper, though I hadn't intended to speak quietly. "Taking out the trash," he replied simply, following my gaze to the entrance. He set down the garbage bag, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he wiped them on his apron. The chime rang out again. Jake's "Welcome to Subway" echoed mine as we both turned to look. This time the door stood wide open, which should have been impossible. Those doors were weighted to close automatically, and even during the worst storms, they'd slam shut immediately. We'd had maintenance check them just last week after corporate's inspection. The mechanism was new, the springs tight and reliable. We stood frozen watching that open door. The night air was dead still. No wind, no passing cars, no movement at all. The parking lot lights cast long shadows across the empty entrance. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and I could see Jake's breath forming small clouds in the suddenly cold air. The bread warmer's orange glow dimmed, though I hadn't heard it cycle off. The napkin dispenser on the nearest table rattled, its contents shifting as if disturbed by an unseen hand. The plastic menu board above us creaked, its laminated surface flexing slightly. For 2 full minutes, we stared at that door, defying the laws of physics by remaining open. The only sound was the quiet hum of the drink cooler and our increasingly shallow breathing. Then it slammed shut with such force that the glass rattled in its frame. The sound echoed through the empty restaurant like a gunshot. The impact sent vibrations through the floor beneath our feet, and several napkins fluttered off the nearby dispenser, dancing in the air before settling on the freshly mopped tiles. The bread warmer surged back to life, its heating elements glowing brighter than before. Jake and I exchanged glances, neither wanting to be the first to move. The digital thermometer by the prep station showed the temperature had dropped to 45 degrees, a full 25 degrees colder than our required holding temperature. As we watched, the numbers slowly climbed back to normal. The bread warmers clicked off their cycle, and the familiar scent of warm bread began to mask the lingering chill in the air. Neither of us moved for several minutes. The only sound was the steady drip of water from the sink where I'd abandoned the dishes. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "I'm going to finish cleaning the ovens," he said, his voice steady but quiet. I nodded and returned to my dishes, but we both kept glancing at the door until our shift ended. I quit 2 weeks later, finding a job at a busy lunch spot that closed at 8 p.m. Jake stayed on for another month before moving to a different store. He told me it never happened again at that location, but he refused to work night shifts after that. Story number 4, I'd been running projection booths since my first job at 16, following in my uncle's footsteps. 3 generations of projectionists in our family. The work suited me well. I was comfortable with solitude, good with my hands, and I'd always found peace in the steady rhythm of machines. 6 years later, I was still at the Cineplex, though now I handled the entire 8-screen operation solo on night shifts. The projection booth was a world above everyone else. 8 theaters stretched out along a narrow corridor, each with its own station of whirring platters and humming electronics. Through small rectangular windows, we could peer down into each auditorium, watching fragments of different films play out in silence while the sound thundered below. Winter nights were the worst for shutdowns. By 11 p.m., I'd start powering down the early shows, moving methodically from Theater 8 toward the front. Each projector's death followed the same sequence. Xenon lamp cooling to black, platter motors winding down, dust covers draped over tomorrow's films. With every shutdown, the corridor grew darker, the distance between active machines stretching longer in the deepening shadows. The mechanical systems had their own language at night. The ancient heating pipes would groan and stutter, especially when temperatures dropped below freezing. Film platters would contract as they cooled, releasing sharp metallic pings that echoed through the corridor. Sometimes the automation system would click randomly, a ghost signal triggering relays in darkened projectors. The building itself seemed to whisper through its ventilation system, currents of air creating odd harmonics in the ducts overhead. The viewing windows transformed one by one. Each portal, once showing dim fragments of the screens below, became a perfect black rectangle. In daylight hours, these windows were just functional tools, letting us check focus and framing. But at night, especially when the building settled into darkness, those windows seemed more like eyes staring back into the booth. The glass gained an odd depth, as if the space beyond extended far deeper than the theater's physical dimensions. I was at Theater 5 throwing the cover over its center platter when movement caught my eye. The window across the corridor, Theater 4's portal, held a face. Not a reflection, not a shadow, but a face. A child's face, pale as projection light, staring directly at me from a position that should have been impossible. The features were unnaturally clear despite the darkness. Eyes too bright, skin too white, expression too still. The window sat a good 8 feet above the highest row of seats. Even with a ladder, there would have been nowhere stable to set it in the steep stadium seating. But logic didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was that face, its features too clear in the darkness, its stillness too perfect. The air around the window seemed to distort slightly, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. I forced myself to look away, counting the seconds it would take to finish covering Theater 5's platters. My hands shook as I adjusted the heavy fabric, and I could feel sweat forming despite the booth's perpetual chill. When I glanced back, the face was gone. The window showed only familiar blackness, but the darkness felt heavier now, more alert. The remaining active projectors cast strange shadows as their reels spun, and every metallic click from cooling equipment made my shoulders tense. That night, I rushed through the rest of shutdown. The usual methodical sequence became a race against my imagination. Each window I passed seemed to hold something just beyond perception, and the growing darkness pressed against my back as I moved from machine to machine. The automation system chose that moment to malfunction, sending phantom signals that made relays click in the darkness behind me. For the rest of my time at the theater, I developed new habits. I started shutting down machines in pairs, keeping the corridor evenly lit as long as possible. I positioned myself to never directly face the viewing windows while covering platters. Sometimes I'd catch myself avoiding Theater 4's window entirely, taking the long way around to reach the projectors beyond it. The face never appeared again, but it had changed something fundamental about that space. During busy showings, when every projector hummed with life and the corridor buzzed with activity, I could almost forget. But late at night, during final shutdown, those black windows waited. The space between active projectors grew longer, darker, more expectant. And sometimes, just as the xenon lamp in Theater 4 cooled to darkness, I could swear I saw a flicker of movement in that impossible space beyond the glass. Story number 5. 3 months into the night shift at Oakwood Elementary, I developed a routine. Clock in at 9, check the locks, then start with the second floor, working my way down systematically through empty hallways that still echoed with daytime chaos. The building had stood since 1947, and at night it remembered every year. At first I rationalized everything. When classroom lights flickered on in rooms I just checked, I blamed faulty wiring. When cabinet doors swung open behind me, it was just old hinges giving way. The sound of children laughing, air moving through ancient ventilation ducts. After all, $16 an hour was good money for a 19-year-old with family to support. The night shift supervisor had warned me about the building's quirks during training. "Old schools make noise," he'd said, not meeting my eyes. "You'll get used to it." He didn't mention the wet footprints that appeared in freshly mopped hallways, or why the first floor corridor always felt 20 degrees colder than the rest of the building. But month by month, the incidents evolved. Classroom doors no longer drifted shut. They slammed with enough force to rattle windows. The children's laughter became screams, cutting through the silence at 2 a.m. I'd find entire rows of desks overturned, papers scattered across floors I'd just mopped. Walking the halls meant dodging projectiles, erasers, pencils, once even a teacher's heavy brass paperweight that crashed into the wall inches from my head. The morning crew had their own stories. They'd arrived to find puddles in the hallways despite no rain, cold spots that moved from room to room, and the lingering scent of chlorine where there shouldn't have been any. But during the day, the building behaved. It was only at night that Oakwood showed its true nature. I adapted, finished my cleaning duties at record speed, then retreated to the main office where an old TV provided background noise. I'd positioned my chair facing the door, volume low enough to hear any approach. The familiar sitcom laughter helped mask the sounds from the hallways. The running footsteps, the scraping of chairs, the occasional splash that seemed to come from somewhere deep below the building's foundation. The official maintenance log became a journal of escalation. Third floor water fountain running on arrival, no signs of activation. Room 204 supplies scattered, no sign of entry. First floor hallway temperature drop, 20+ degrees below building average. My supervisor ignored the reports. The morning crew complained about wet footprints leading nowhere. One night, checking the first floor bathrooms, I found all the faucets running full blast, steaming mirrors obscuring the reflection of small figures standing behind me. When I turned, they vanished, leaving only wet footprints that led to solid walls. The water from the taps was ice cold and smelled of chlorine. The activity seemed to intensify around 3 a.m., particularly near the east wing of the first floor. The tile floor there had subtle irregularities, as if the foundation beneath had shifted. During quieter moments, pressing an ear to the cold floor revealed distant echoes, splashing muffled voices, the hollow sound of water in a large space. It was a Tuesday night when everything changed. I was in the office, half watching a late-night talk show, when the temperature plummeted. My breath clouded in front of me as invisible hands gripped the back of my chair. The force yanked backward, sending me crashing to the floor. As I scrambled up, I caught a glimpse in the dark window's reflection. Small figures standing in the doorway, their clothes and hair dripping wet. I ran to my car, leaving wet footprints behind me that weren't my own. As I pulled out of the parking lot, the school's lights flickered in every window, a silent farewell from whatever lived in that building. Through my rearview mirror, I swore I could see children pressed against the first floor windows, their faces distorted by rivulets of water that ran upward against the glass. Years later, during Oakwood's demolition, the crew made a discovery that validated every night of terror. Beneath the first floor corridor lay an Olympic-sized swimming pool, its blue tiles still vibrant despite decades underground. And on the pool's floor, preserved in the everlasting dampness, were dozens of small handprints pressed into the surface. reaching upward through 60 years of darkness. Story number 6. After 3 years on graveyard with the county sheriff's department, I'd learned to trust my instincts about the darkness between 2 and 4 a.m., those hours when the world feels thinnest. My partner Davis had been working nights even longer. Together we'd handled everything from drunk drivers to domestic disputes, but neither of us was prepared for what happened during that late October shift. Most deputies hated the rural zones, but I'd grown to appreciate the quiet. Endless stretches of county roads, abandoned barns slowly sinking into forgotten fields, and the occasional call that broke the monotony. Usually they were simple things: trespassing teens, tripped business alarms, or the random cow wandering onto someone's property. The alarm activation that came in at 2:47 a.m. should have been equally routine. The call came from a residential address we'd never patrolled before, which was unusual for our area. We knew every property on our beat: the seasonal hunting cabins, the meth labs we'd busted, the elderly residents who sometimes forgot their alarm codes. But this address was unfamiliar, and finding it took longer than expected. The house sat far back from the road without a single light to guide us. When we finally located it, our patrol car's headlights revealed a structure that seemed to reject modern intrusion. Spiderwebs draped every surface like ancient lace, and the complete absence of typical household items, no trash cans, no garden ornaments, no sign of daily life, made it feel more like a photograph of a house than an actual residence. Following protocol, Davis and I split up to check the perimeter. I took the near side, finding a carport in a padlocked workshop on the ground level. Nothing unusual except for the absolute silence. No crickets, no distant traffic, not even the sound of our radios carrying across the property. In 3 years of night patrol, I'd never encountered such complete stillness. The exterior stairs led to a massive covered porch that wrapped around the second floor like an observation deck. 4 separate seating areas of weathered wicker furniture created the impression of an abandoned resort rather than a private residence. As Davis joined me upstairs, we discussed the bizarre layout, but something else nagged at my attention, a creeping unease I couldn't quite place. Through the sliding glass doors, the interior looked frozen in time. Shag carpeting straight out of 1962, furniture arranged in rigid conversation circles, and a conspicuous absence of any modern technology. No television, no computer, not even a digital clock. The dispatch update only added to the strangeness. Attic exit alarm activation. Specific and unusual. Looking up from our position on the porch, we spotted the attic access panel with its modern alarm sensors, an incongruous addition to the preserved in amber atmosphere. After losing a game of rock, paper, scissors, I found myself ascending the narrow ladder, service weapon drawn. The climb felt endless, each rung taking me further from the relative safety of the porch. The attic smell hit me before I could fully clear the opening. Not the expected mustiness of stored holiday decorations and forgotten furniture, but something more organic. It carried the lingering presence of elderly occupants, as if decades of living had somehow been distilled into the air itself. Not decay exactly, but the absence of life. A quick sweep revealed no immediate threats, just shadows and that persistent odor that reminded me of my grandmother's nursing home in her final days. Back on solid ground, Davis's attempt at humor didn't help. Maybe we were looking at it wrong, not something trying to get in, but something trying to get out. We laughed it off and headed back to our vehicles, but the joke lodged somewhere uncomfortable in my mind. The drive back to our observation point should have been routine. I led in my patrol car, Davis following close behind, both of us eager to put some distance between ourselves and that time capsule house. About a mile down the road, movement caught my eye, a figure standing at the intersection. Even in my peripheral vision, the details registered with unsettling clarity. A black woman in dark clothing, clutching what appeared to be a light-colored bag. Before I could process what I'd seen, Davis's voice crackled over the radio, calling in a pedestrian stop at that exact intersection. We executed coordinated U-turns, arriving back at the spot within 20 seconds. The intersection stood empty. No footprints in the dew-damp grass along the shoulder. No movement in the surrounding shadows. But when we compared notes, our descriptions matched perfectly. down to the specific way she held the bag. The house's alarm never activated again, at least not on our watch. But in the months that followed, other oddities crept into our patrol routine. Equipment malfunctions that resolved themselves as soon as we logged them. Radio transmissions that picked up fragments of big band music. The lingering scent of that attic appearing briefly in our vehicles during the darkest hours of our shift. Whatever came out of that attic that night was still with us when I was leaving.